Hey guys, welcome to our stem cells lesson. I looked for some good videos about stem cells, but I couldn't find any, so I'm just going to walk you guys through it. Please take notes as we go, all right? And let me know if you have any questions. I have this slideshow we'll go through. Some of you may have heard of stem cells, and some of you may not have, but it's this really hotly debated issue in both politics and science. So it's pretty important to understand what we're talking about when we discuss stem cells and stem cell research. So we'll start with what are stem cells and why are they important? A stem cell is a really unique cell in your body. Most cells in your body have these very specialized jobs. They have a special shape and a special form and a special function. So like a muscle cell does its job differently from a bone cell or a skin cell. Stem cells are different in that they don't have a job yet. They're kind of like a little kid who hasn't decided what they want to be when they grow up yet. But they can become really whatever they need to become. So if you take a look here at a stem cell, it can become a couple of different things. Stem cells can make more of themselves. They can reproduce and divide and create more stem cells. They can also become any kind of specialized cell that they want. They could become a liver cell, a muscle cell, a blood cell, a skin cell. They could become a neuron. And that's what's so amazing about stem cells, is that a muscle cell, once it's a muscle cell, it will only ever be a muscle cell. Same with all the other specialized cells in your body, but stem cells can be anything, and that's pretty amazing scientific finding for us. So, why is this unique? Most of the trillions of cells in your body, and you have about 100 trillion cells, each have a job that will never change, right? So a muscle cell can only contract. A red blood cell will only have the job of carrying oxygen until it dies. And these cells can never change their shape or their job, but stem cells can. So if you're lucky enough to find yourself some stem cells and have the resources to cultivate them, you can give them these little genetic signals and chemical signals and direct them to become something that you need. And so that's why it's so important that we study them. So the idea is that stem cells could potentially replace any damaged cell in your body. So if you get hit by a car, if you contract a disease, or if you're going through heart failure, right, then we could hypothetically use stem cells to replace or regenerate those damaged cells. And actually, we're doing some of that right now. Stem cells are currently used to treat spinal cord injuries, type 1 diabetes, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, heart disease, strokes, burns, certain types of cancer, arthritis, and a lot of other things. The reason we can do so many things with stem cells is because they can transform into any of the 220 different types of cells in the body. There are two different types of stem cells, and it's really important to understand the difference between them. So the two places we can get stem cells are from an embryo. These are called embryonic stem cells, and an embryo is just a fertilized egg. And the other place is we can get them from adult cells because, you know, your skin cells die all the time, and you have skin stem cells that are replacing those damaged cells. So we call those stem cells that we get in different parts of the adult body somatic stem cells, right? So those are our two sources, embryos and then the adult body. So let's start with embryonic stem cells. Excuse me. So you have this little embryo here, right? The sperm has met the egg. It's a fertilized egg now, and it starts to reproduce. And it creates this little bundle of cells within 3 to 5 days. Scientists can then go into that little bundle of cells and take out the stem cells and cultivate them, which is you put them in like a culture with nutrients and with the right chemical signals, and those signals can then turn those stem cells into whatever the doctors or scientists are looking for. All right. It's a little different with adult stem cells, those somatic stem cells. You can find stem cells in many different places in the adult body, but they can't be turned into anything. like the embryonic stem cells. Like if you find a stem cell in the liver, it might only be able to make new liver cells, maybe a few other types. But these stem cells can't become whatever they want or whatever we direct them to become. So they're not as versatile. And the differences between these two are important and pretty hotly debated. So if we compare embryonic stem cells and somatic stem cells, we know that the embryonic stem cells come from embryos and somatic stem cells come from adults. These embryonic stem cells can become any type of cell and they can keep reproducing. They can make more and more and more of themselves kind of forever. Whereas the adult stem cells can't become any type of cell and they also eventually die out. They can't keep making new cells indefinitely. Embryonic stem cells can be rejected by your body, whereas somatic stem cells, as long as they come from your body, they're not going to be rejected because your body is already used to them. Embryonic stem cells haven't been very well studied, which actually comes down to these ethical issues. People have problems with studying embryonic stem cells, which we'll get to, which is why they've only had animal trials, no human trials. Whereas we discovered somatic adult stem cells in the 1960s, and we have studied them well. There aren't a lot of ethical debates, and so these have been really well studied. And then the last thing is that embryonic stem cells, you know exactly where to find them, whereas somatic stem cells are kind of hard to track down in the body because they're just floating around in with all your other cells. So let's talk about those ethical concerns that I just mentioned, and there are always ethical concerns in science. Scientists have not historically made ethical choices. They've done a lot of things for the sake of science and rationalized hurting a lot of people in the process. So we're going to take a look at that and some cases that have had to do with stem cells. So we're going to look here. This woman here, her name was Henrietta Lacks, and she had just in 1951 given birth to her fifth child. And she went to visit Johns Hopkins Hospital, which was one of the few hospitals treating African Americans at the time. And she was complaining about pain and bleeding. And when they did the examination, they discovered that she had advanced cervical cancer. And so it was very hard to treat at the time. They didn't have very many effective treatments. The doctors biopsied her cancer cells, but they also took some of those healthy cells nearby, and they sent all those cells off to a lab to be studied. And as those cells were being studied, scientists discovered that her cells were extremely unique. So they've been studying a lot of people's cells, and those cells kept dying. They weren't able to regenerate and make new cells. What they found with Henrietta's cells was that they were immortal, which is to say they kept making more and more of themselves, and they never stopped. They doubled their numbers every 20 to 24 hours, and they just thrived. And scientists called these HeLa cells. HeLa, they took the HE from Henrietta, and they took the LA from Lacks, her last name, and named them HeLa cells. Henrietta died of cancer, of cervical cancer that year. But her cells were used to create treatments for polio, HIV/AIDS, Parkinson's, cancer, and a lot of other things. And there are trillions of her cells out there today being studied by scientists and used in research. The problem is, and here's where we hit our ethical issue, nobody asked Henrietta or even told her or her family that they would be taking, studying, experimenting on, and selling her cells for decades and decades to come. So Henrietta's children and grandchildren and even great-grandchildren for all this time have had difficulty even getting basic health care and accessing the health care they need. Meanwhile, their relative had donated unwillingly and unknowingly her cells to help all these other people cure their diseases and treat their diseases. So you can see how scientists rationalized the taking of this person's cells without her permission or knowledge, and kind of told themselves that it would be for the greater good, that it would benefit so many people. But in science, we consider that an extremely unethical practice. So that's one. I'm going to get back to this one later, but there are also issues with the embryonic stem cells that people talk about. So these stem cells come from fertilization clinics, like fertility clinics, where people struggling with infertility have stored their fertilized eggs. A lot of times those people get pregnant and then they decide not to use the rest of their fertilized eggs. So they give permission to the scientists to use the leftover embryos for research. This is controversial for a lot of people, however, because some people believe that life begins at conception. So as soon as that sperm hits the egg, it's basically a living thing to them. And so the argument is that if you're destroying these stem cells, you're essentially taking a life. And so this is why in the US anyways, there has been very little embryonic stem cell research. In other areas of the world, like Europe, there are many, many more studies. But here in the US, this remains really controversial. So those are some of our ethical issues and concerns. We'll be talking more about this. In fact, we'll be digging quite a bit deeper into the Henrietta Lacks issue. But please let me know if you have any questions, and have a great day.